So let me kick it off, and sorry, I'm going to read some of these, so apologies for that. But it's really interesting, like how much GraphQL, in my experience, I think we've all seen this, has entered mainstream adoption. It's crossed the chasm. You know, we like see mainstream organizations adopting it at scale, deploying it into production. And I think that's really fueled a lot of what we see here, like everyone here at this conference, the number of participants in the community and the state of the technology that's evolving. And we see a lot of new innovations there. But then it becomes like, hey, as a community, what's the governance model for all this? And how do we coordinate in the community to make sure that we're building open specs and like having shared technologies underpinning GraphQL so it continues to be successful? So Lee, maybe we can get your thoughts initially on how we maintain that moving forward.
Yeah, and folks jump in and have a conversation with me along the way. But this is, I think, the most important thing that the GraphQL Foundation is responsible for is identifying these common patterns, bringing them back, and creating open standards around them. So there's both a process angle to this and then also a governance angle to this. The process angle is allowing things to go through these phases of let 1,000 flowers bloom, look for trends, and allow the innovation to occur, and make sure that there's space relative to the spec that allows for that. And then as we start to find patterns that are emergent and where they start to create actual interoperation problems, then there's opportunities for us to pull that back and figure out what do we standardize, how do we create value from that standardization such that new people can create tools that interop with other folks' tools. Yuri's talk today, I think that was a great example of how all of these different tools, some of them do similar things, some of them do different things, but they can all interrelate to each other and create a healthier ecosystem that allows us to do more things. The sum is greater than their parts. Then there's the sort of governance angle, which is, okay, how do you get folks who might work at companies that compete with one another to collaborate on something that allows them to do that? The first is to make the clear case that when we collaborate on a standard that is open, then it allows all of us to share a customer base and allow that customer base to grow, to unlock new capabilities that we wouldn't have been able to do on our own, and to avoid issues like vendor lock-in or other things that can cause the customer base to be worried that their solution isn't stable. At the GraphQL Foundation, we've been finding reasonably innovative ways to model this. I think there's standards bodies are not a new thing. They've been around as long as the tech industry has been around. But I'm really pleased with we have something called the Joint Development Foundation, the JDF, which is a piece of the Linux Foundation. They have a whole suite of tools, and that's the primary place that the GraphQL Foundation has been going to look for that toolbox to allow us to work together. So the GraphQL spec itself is modeled around the JDF's tool base. And that's essentially, I know many of the folks in this room have contributed to part of the core GraphQL project list in the past. Thank you. And if you've done, you've probably had to sign a thing. This is the CLA, and you're signing the JDF paperwork in order to contribute. And then as we find new projects, we bring them in. So an example from a couple of years ago was the GraphQL HTTP project. Lots of people doing GraphQL over the web. We should standardize that. That's a foundation project. Or most very recently is the Fusion effort that Michael Steib started, and then Yuri's participated in, as have a bunch of others recently. And we're like, okay, now's the moment where this is only really going to work if this is an ecosystem project rather than just a couple of companies working on this. And so the foundation is going to pick that up as well and make that a formal JDF project.
And I think one of the important things that we do with that is we're careful about what we specify, right? We specify how the tools can interoperate by describing the behavior, but we don't strictly specify exactly how that works. And that goes for the GraphQL spec, it goes for Fusion. This still gives companies ways of innovating on this base, but still having something to show why their one is better, but it still interoperates with all of the other ones. So I think that's excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the tension of what to put under the foundation and what not is very, very. You have to be very slow and very gentle in that. Sometimes if you put a certain implementation under the foundation, it also, and you might call it official, then it actually might prevent competition. And I think, having a spec actually under a foundation and then having competing implementation is very, very important. And you can always expand the spec, right? Like in the JavaScript, like in the ECMAScript, right? even if something is not yet like official in the spec, and we can talk about defer in GraphQL, like people can still adopt it. Like implementation can, be better than their competition while they implement things that are not officially yet in the spec. And that actually gives us feedback to later on, add it to the spec, but after, we actually see the, actual people using it and getting real feedback from it. So it's kind of like this weird dance with like innovation, competition, and like...
Yeah, and it means that the innovation is happening fast, and then we're kind of very intentionally going slow below it to make sure that there's room for that.
But we have to keep in mind as well, of course, that anyone who implements the spec, any changes we make, everyone who implements the spec has to do it. So we have to be sure that this is a real good value add, and we get that from the community, seeing whether they actually need the feature.
That's right.
And I think that the competition is actually very healthy, right? I mean, if you're looking at this, that's driving us to honestly get the user more happy, right? In order for them to use my implementation, I need to make sure that I'm giving them something that will make them damn good. So it's my responsibility to make you happy. And I think this is critical. So I think that that's why it's really beautifully kind of like orchestrated for the good of the community, which I think is key here, because that's the only way to innovate. If you're looking at other ecosystems, this is like, that's how we're moving faster, doing it together.
That sounds, it's like two layers of a level playing system, basically. There's this very organic model of an open community where you can innovate and create technologies, and then you get to a critical mass where you can actually maybe put that into a spec or start to standardize it, and then create a level playing field for everyone in that market, right? Yeah. Awesome. All right, next question. So I thought Tio had a really interesting talk yesterday, that his kind of take on GraphQL and maybe compare and contrast with TRPC. And so I'd love to get perspective, maybe Uri, we'll start with you, on just like how you feel like about Tio's framing of GraphQL and maybe just get your thoughts.
To be honest, I was very happy with this talk, I think. A lot of people were nervous and a lot of people were like, thinking, oh my God, this is the end of, he's going to say like, I don't know, horrible things about GraphQL and you shouldn't use it. And I think actually framed it in a very nice way, like you said, and I really believe in the idea of never introduce complexity before you actually encounter it. And I think we've seen that also in our community as well. Like, you can have, we have, I don't know, one example is like, we have Facebook building like crazy scale, the craziest scale of GraphQL and not federating anything. That's just like shows you that like sometimes having like a more complex pattern is not maybe something you have to do. On the other hand, like federation and like, and that architecture became very successful. So I think that, and I think what his talk highlights also is that and I think Tanmay mentioned that as well, like for me, the peak developer experience in GraphQL is not yet reached. I think that's why I was so excited with like Houdini and Isograph. I think those are tools, and there are many other things that are happening in the ecosystem. Like we are, and that's why I was also very excited about this conference. Like there's so many things that are happening that I think both Tio's talk and Mark Andre's talk were looking at like where GraphQL is right now, and then those were also, I looked at these talks as opportunities. Okay, I 100% agree with everything Tio says, but then he looks at where GraphQL is today, and then that's why I told him like you really should like go to like Alex's talk or like maybe it will change.
Apply pressure, try to like okay then what?
Yeah.
But so I really enjoy every chance I get to spend with Tio. I think he's a super smart engineer and communicator, and is always like very sharp on the pragmatism. Like that's his approach there. Is like, we do the thing that is the simplest tool for the job. 1000% agree. And sometimes it's not GraphQL. Like if we're just like, GraphQL, all the things, no, not healthy. Sometimes it's the great tool. And then GraphQL used to be a one thing that you would do, but these days there's many different flavors and shapes. And if you're doing a federated approach versus a simple approach, a monolith, the schema first, a code first, there's just a lot of variation there as well, which is fantastic. More variation fits more patterns. And then appreciating the fact that there's different shaped companies who serve differently shaped customers and markets, a developer shaped customer versus, a consumer or an enterprise. and then different shaped products that were built. So it's, the difference between a web-based like SaaS tool is very different from an iOS mobile app that's going to be used by 1 million people. And you're going to use different technology choices along the way. And wise engineers look at that through the lens of pragmatism and say, what is the appropriate set of tools that I will have to solve the problem set in front of me? And there can just never possibly be one answer because it's a different shape for each. So I thought that was the thing I appreciated most from Teo's talk, was articulating the fact that, and he went through the like, okay, let's look at some of those variations that probably apply to this audience, and was like very honest about where one solution would fit and another one might not, which I thought was really great.
Yeah, and I will echo it. Actually, I don't know if you know that, but when we started Solo, actually, so we're building tooling for platform engineering, right? Honestly, I wish we had your user experience. We are suck at it. But one of the things that we basically did is, I immediately kind of like said, okay, we need to do some UI. Usually our UI is very dumb, it's not that interesting, it's kind of like a YAML representation. But I chose GraphQL. And we basically did it, and honestly, we needed to depart it from it. And the reason is because it didn't give us any value, and it's actually, for that use case, it was way, way overcomplicated. So I 100% agree with this, even though I'm a big fan of GraphQL, that you need to use the right tool for the job.
I would also just add one more point into that, related to what I said also in my previous keynote. Because now, so from being able to basically convert any API to GraphQL and doing the other way around, how we started thinking about GraphQL is not GraphQL or not GraphQL anymore. Like we started when we approach companies and they're like, should I use GraphQL? And they're very scared from that question. Like, this thing, GraphQL, we're just like, we started listing all the different features that GraphQL gives you. And then we're like, okay, prioritize what are those things that you need and when do you need them. And then we're trying, instead of just telling them, migrate to GraphQL, let's use this ability from GraphQL. And then when you're ready. And then so it's even more granular and even more pragmatic than the approach of when do you actually onboard GraphQL. You can even, the onboarding process could be broken down into specific features that GraphQL gives us. So that's,
Awesome. All right. We were talking about TRPC there, and just while we're talking about the broader ecosystem of frameworks and protocols and this type of thing, and languages, right? Rust and the rest of the ecosystem. These communities exist in other projects, right? And we're trying to track how do you align and line up great innovation that's happening in those communities along with what's happening with the great innovation in our community, staying relevant, staying integrated with those things. Benjie, we'll start with you. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think one of the great things about the modern software, especially open source, is we just learn so much from each other. And we were talking about competition earlier, but having the level playing field. It's great. Everyone tries all these different ideas, and the things that work stick, and then we sort of raise the baseline for everyone, and then we just keep doing it over and over again as an entire community. And I think that's just a great experience.
Yeah, I love that. Awesome. While we're talking about being relevant and maybe a little hypey, let's go back to AI. And so, AI is on everyone's mind. Everyone's playing around with ChatGPT and generative AI, and I think we're all looking for ways. I think most folks are intellectually curious about it independently, but then also much more than that. I definitely think there's a FOMO effect or a fear of missing out with hey, if other people in the market, if my competitors are leveraging AI, are they getting a leg forward and this type of thing? So, I really enjoyed your talk, Idit, but then also maybe an opportunity for you to expand and for others to jump in. For folks here that are thinking maybe they're interested in AI and what that next incremental step could be, what do you think that might be?
Yeah, so I think that in AI there's a few things, right? First of all, there is those models that already exist is very useful, GPT. So people should leverage that. I think the idea with AI, we're always talking about, you mentioned something very interesting, or you basically said, we are not in the peak of the user experience. I agree with you, and I do think that AI could bring us there. Yeah. I think there is some help that it can bring. I think it can help performance. I think everything that is hard to automate, AI has a space. And that's the question that we need to ask ourselves. Where that we really need to use it exactly like every technology. We don't want to put it everywhere. So I do think that it can help definitely with the user experience. And I think that, as I said, if something that is complicated to implement, it can probably help there a lot. I will say that AI is a very complex thing, right? I mean, we talked, and I very simplified that in my talk, there is an input and output, but honestly, there's also the models and they are art, and you need to train them, and it's costing a lot of money. And how to fine-tuning, this is a lot of statistic. I showed the first math. That's really how it is. It's not the simple acquisition that I put. So I feel that though there is a lot of excitement, there was a lot of work to do to get until, honestly, it will change drastically our life in the infrastructure.
It's exciting to me how that is, while that is very true, you mentioned this progression from sort of like these two very large, almost monopolistic players being really the only ones who were figuring out ways to develop that and roll that out. And now we're seeing lots of people do it, either building the core tools or finding utilization of those tools. So there is an ecosystem that's evolving. So like I'm feeling very optimistic that in a couple of years, okay, this part that's really hard to like establish the model and train the model will not feel so hard anymore, that we'll have built up the right toolkit for being able to do that. And I so appreciated the, I feel like especially with AI has been so hypey lately, people are thinking about, okay, how can I get ChatGPT specifically to do a thing, like the generative AI specific slice of the problem, and forgetting the fact that there's this whole machine learning optimization angle. There's just like a lot of space to it, and the examples that you gave were very sharp. One example that I thought you might have given that you didn't, that I'm really excited about, and I was linking it back to Benjie's talk on GraphFast, was the idea of optimizing a query planner. So my mental model for AI is useful to this space is essentially decision making at scale, where Benjie had all these really interesting examples in his talk. If you haven't seen it from yesterday, you should go watch the video of, given a particular GraphQL query, what might the set of SQL queries that you run look like? And if you're a smart developer, you could just literally write those. And oftentimes we describe this as like, well, if you did that, then you just have one-off endpoints, and GraphQL is a generalizing factor. But like, imagine a world where you had as many engineers on your team as there were potential variants of GraphQL queries. You're like, I have 2 million developers. So I'll just assign each developer to perfectly optimizing the SQL queries for my graph. That's what AI could be. Like, AI is this decision-making at scale where we can eventually get to the spot where we say, what's the perfect execution plan for this particular query? Because there's so many little smart decisions that you need to be able to make to do it. So I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but that's the thing that I'm really excited about.
So actually, we did thought about it, the plan, and it was there. And the reason I took it out, honestly, is because of the performance problem. Think about exactly what's going on. Somehow, when the request is coming, you need to be fast enough. So the question, right, it's latency. It's important to us. So AI there on the request path, it's always a little bit complex because it will slow down drastically. So just how to do this, and we thought about it, we said, so we will put it and we will fit it. It's just, because it's on the request, but there are going to be some challenges with this, so I decided to take it. That's great. But we did talk about it with Yuval and Scott, how we can optimize that.
So I think one of the interesting things there is that using AI as like a supervisor. So you have the system do something, do a query plan or do a number of query plans, and the AI can learn which ones work well. And of course, they're great at like number crunching. They're great at like spotting patterns, like you said in your talk. So query planning's been a thing for 50 years, pretty much, right? Since databases have been a thing. And generally what you do is you come up with a query plan, and then more modern, you look at the data and the statistics, and maybe you evolve that query plan. But again, it's this query has this query plan. And one of the things I think AI can do that would be more subtle than that is actually, here's this query and the main query plan, here's these inputs. Actually, if this input, if this number's higher than a certain threshold, let's use this query plan or this one. Like learning to make query planning more subtle.
Yes.
Branching, which is really hard to do.
50% of the time this strategy is better, and 50% of the time that strategy is better. And what
are the rules?
Yeah, what are the rules and how do you decide? And it's like, well, you have to go look at the production traffic and train them. You're training a model, and then you have to, we're smarter, so we know actually in the scenarios that you've been running in prod, this scenario is in fact 80% more likely to be faster. We'll choose that one. And there's, I think, just a lot of opportunity. That's obviously quite complicated, talking about it in a very simplistic frame. So you have the appropriate big fat asterisks there. Of there be dragons. I think there's a lot of work to do, but that's the thing I'm excited about.
No, I'm excited about.
I think I see that as I look at those things as I separated for two things. One is developer experience, like in developer tools, like we talked about right now. I would say that in this area, together with optimizations that you talked about, like we have Hive or we have a schema registry that basically stores thousands or hundreds of thousands of schemas. And we started questioning ourselves, like, what if we actually run through all the data and start to give people like recommendations for how they build their schemas, right? Like kind of like a linter, but like a super linter, right? Like let's look at all the schemas that everyone wrote about a certain thing, and now let's give you all kinds of ideas of how to build it better, and that might also suggest like optimizations or better patterns, or we have a lot of talks in the conference about best practices, and what if we could AI those talks? Like we could actually look at all the patterns that people are using successfully and bring that into the development process of GraphQL. So that's like from, we're all developers here. So that's like from the developer side. But I also want to like us to think about, the bigger picture. Like we're building applications. And I think for me, there's like a big thing about how applications look like in like 3 years from now. And I think it's tied to GraphQL a lot. There's, by the way, 2 other talks, I think today. One is Alexandra's talks about malleable apps, and one is Anand's from IBM. And which I think, if I understand what they're talking about, is kind of related to that. But I think that until now we build apps and we try to, all of the work that we're doing is to build the right screens for a specific user and try to guess all the things that they would want to do in the best way. But if we look at like how people use ChatGPT today, they ask them a question and then they get an answer, and then they ask another question. There's kind of an interaction, and you get the answer in a certain way. And what if the AI basically builds you a mini app per what you need right now? And I think if we think about you ask questions and you get back a graph, or you get back a button. And if we look at how GraphQL, let's say Relay and GraphQL, like we can actually now, like the building blocks for this app builder would be a schema of all the data that you can query everywhere. And then it could be just a bunch of, let's call it React components that are correlated with their GraphQL fragments, so they know exactly what data they need to bring. And now, it's not, instead of us putting all those React components together and bringing like the data and building an app, this will be structured for you by a smarter thing on the spot.
It's nice.
Skynet brought to you by AI and GraphQL. All right. All right, that's all the time we have for the panel. So thank you very much to our panelists for joining. I think we're all right.
Thank you.